Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Impossible AI programming test. Aliens write code, human teaches AI to write itself. In the heart of the Zorlan star cluster floated the Intergalactic Academy of Sciences, a massive structure made of translucent alloy and quantum-folded metals that shimmered like a galaxy itself. It wasn't merely a university. It was the most prestigious institution in the known universe, attended by the brightest minds from hundreds of star systems. Students from insectoid planets, crystalline moons, gaseous giants, and artificial mega-cities gathered within its orbiting halls to challenge themselves against impossible tasks. It was here that the greatest programming minds came together once every cycle for what was known as the Impossible AI Challenge. This year's test had been anticipated with greater excitement than any before. Whispers had spread across campuses of solar systems, hinting that the Academy's lead professor, a Threon Garnakian named Professor Durs, had devised an assignment so complex it would take weeks just to comprehend the instructions. The challenge, to build an artificial intelligence that could independently adapt, self-learn, and reprogram itself when encountering unknown environments. Not only that, the AI had to perform with minimal data input, learn from its surroundings, and function flawlessly within a simulation of galactic war zones, economic collapses, and alien logic puzzles. All the top students had been preparing in silence. Some uploaded vast code libraries directly into their nervous systems. Others merged with external processors to simulate the possible scenarios. One group of insectoid twins from the Cray system even designed a cooperative AI that was capable of splitting its consciousness across two separate bots. The tension in the coding chambers was suffocating as the day approached. Among these elite minds stood a human, Jake Carter. He was an exchange student from Earth, a planet still considered a technological toddler by the Galactic Standards Committee. While others spoke in lines of binary-infused language or exchanged telepathic scripts, Jake spoke with a thick English accent and a relaxed tone. The alien students didn't know whether to pity him or ignore him. Many whispered that he was only here due to some Earth ambassador's request. Some assumed he would drop out within a week, and yet Jake remained. He had no implants, no internal processors, and refused to wear the neural interface recommended by the Academy. Instead, he brought a dusty old laptop from Earth, which he affectionately called Maggie. No one took it seriously. Maggie wheezed when she booted up, made odd clicking noises at night, and her screen flickered like a dying sun. To most of the alien students, it was the digital equivalent of trying to win a galactic race in a wooden cart. Jake, however, was not perturbed. He had grown up on Earth debugging broken systems, building software in garages with unreliable power, and finding creative solutions because he didn't have the luxury of quantum assistance. He was used to working with limitations. That was his edge, and nobody in that room understood that yet. When the day of the challenge arrived, the Academy's Great Hall of Execution, a name that sounded far more dramatic than it was, hummed with energy. Students took their places in their assigned simulation pods, which were suspended in midair by anti-gravity fields. Transparent walls formed around each station, shielding the work of every student from outside interference. Inside each pod was a neural link chair, several data panels, and a simulation core that projected various virtual environments in real time. Jake took his station slowly, placing Maggie down gently like one would place an old friend in an unfamiliar seat. He ignored the raised brows of the alien students around him. He had learned early in his life that there was no point trying to impress people who had already decided he wasn't worth respecting. He simply smiled to himself, plugged in his power cord to the universal converter, and began. Professor Dureza's voice echoed across the chamber, his tone deep, mathematical, and held the kind of gravity that silenced even the most excitable species. You have 72 hours to build a self-evolving artificial intelligence. The AI must operate autonomously in 15 extreme scenarios, each designed to test its capacity to adapt, self-correct, and reprogram under unpredictable stimuli. Any form of preft knowledge bases or reliance on external guidance systems is strictly prohibited. Good luck. Begin. A low hum pulsed through the room. Lights dimmed. Screens lit up. The simulation pods activated, surrounding each student with a complex feed of visualized code, alien languages, holographic symbols, and interactive blocks. Most students immediately activated their neural links, letting their brains feed directly into the simulation system. Fingers twitched, thoughts fired faster than the speed of light, and code began pouring onto the glowing walls of each pod. Jake didn't plug in anything. He sat back, opened a text editor on Maggie, and began typing with slow precision. He didn't bother with advanced syntax highlighting or dynamic compilers. He wrote with simplicity, one function at a time. He stared at the simulation rules on a small monitor beside him, scratched his chin, and began sketching ideas on a napkin he pulled out of his pocket. Outside his pod, some students took note. A tentacled engineer from the Zarn Collective tried not to laugh when he saw Jake using what looked like a pen. A crystalline scholar from Nexos buzzed a message to her neighbor, "The human is drawing on organic tissue. Do you think that's a form of primitive logic planning?" Jake ignored all of it. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was thinking about the problem differently. While everyone else was trying to build an AI that could handle extreme cases by preloading it with possible outcomes, Jake had another idea. Instead of teaching the AI how to respond, why not teach it how to learn how to respond? Why give it a limited database of knowledge when it could be taught the very rules of learning itself? He remembered an old conversation with his father back when Jake was just a teenager struggling to build his first neural net. "Son," his father had said, "never try to write a perfect answer. Write something that knows how to find one." That was his inspiration. Instead of thousands of lines of code, Jake wrote a simple loop, a recursive function that didn't know anything but knew how to observe, test, evaluate, and rewrite itself. He gave it basic sensory logic: look, analyze, compare, improve. No hard-coded survival parameters, no pre-written escape functions. He just created a framework that allowed the AI to change its own rules based on what worked and what didn't. He called it Core Curious and let it decide the rest. Hours passed. While others were immersed in simulation scenarios, yelling commands in languages that echoed across dimensions, Jake sipped tea from a thermos he had smuggled in. He didn't even seem stressed. Maggie beeped occasionally, gently warming under his palms. The old laptop might have been outdated by alien standards, but Jake knew every inch of her code. She was reliable. By the end of the first day, some students had already run into critical failures. Their AIs were breaking down in test scenarios. One student's AI had collapsed during a black hole economic simulation, triggering a total system meltdown. Another's bot refused to adapt to unknown language inputs and got stuck in an infinite loop. Jake's code, meanwhile, had begun to rewrite itself quietly, methodically, and without error. He didn't tell anyone. He just leaned back in his chair, placed his napkin sketch inside Maggie's case, and whispered, "Good girl." And so while the galaxy's brightest minds fought tooth and tentacle to outcode one another, a human with an old laptop and a recursive loop sat calmly in the center of it all, building something none of them had thought to try. By the morning of the second day, the air inside the simulation chamber felt heavier, not from pressure but from the intensity of mental focus. Even though each student worked within a separate pod, the collective weight of their calculations created a strange tension that pulsed like a living force through the metallic walls of the academy. Screens flickered under the burden of code being written and rewritten at unnatural speed, and the constant background noise of artificial intelligence engines murmuring to themselves filled the void with a low digital hum. Within Pod 47, a student named Trexel, a mantis-like alien from the Velair species, was twitching his claws in frustration. His AI had successfully completed the early adaptation trial only to crash when introduced to the unpredictable logic structures of the simulated Ulick puzzle world. The issue wasn't the code itself. Trexel's structure was precise and technically flawless. The problem was scope. His AI was too large, too cautious, too dependent on decision trees that couldn't stretch across the vast and chaotic parameters of the simulation. He hissed to himself and began deleting segments of his neural lattice matrix, hoping to rebuild a leaner version before the next phase began. In Pod 51, a tall serpentine student named Shenrith glided across her interface screen with elegance. Her scales shimmered like polished copper as her long fingers navigated multidimensional arrays that only her species could interpret properly. Her AI was unique. It used emotional inference modules based on chemical resonance, allowing it to make decisions by feeling its environment rather than logically computing it. It had performed well in the empathy-driven trade negotiation simulation, but when dropped into the Martian dust storm crisis, an exercise that required immediate technical improvisation, it hesitated and failed to adapt. Shanrith snarled softly and began rewriting her override protocols, furious that her intuition-based model lacked tactical aggression. Around the room, similar scenes unfolded. Some students argued with their own AIs, shouting corrections at interfaces that refused to respond in time. Others paced back and forth, rerunning simulations in loops, hoping the next version wouldn't collapse under pressure. For many of them, the problem wasn't intelligence, it was overdesign. The more complex their creations became, the more brittle they turned out to be under dynamic stress. Meanwhile, Jake sat quietly. He hadn't changed his posture since the previous day. He still leaned slightly back, feet crossed at the ankles beneath Maggie's console. His fingers hovered just above the keyboard, not in anticipation but in thought. Maggie was running the third environment test on his AI, a rotating anomaly field that disrupted all sensor inputs every 4.3 seconds. Most students hated this challenge. Their AIs became blind, lost spatial awareness, or looped into false conclusions. Jake's program, however, didn't panic. It observed. Every time the anomaly triggered, the AI wrote a small adjustment to its recognition protocol. It noted the patterns of disruption. It calculated the field's interference pattern not as a threat but as data to use. Instead of resisting the anomaly, it absorbed its behavior into its logic stream. Within 15 minutes, Jake's AI began moving through the field with more fluidity than even the simulation's native drone. Jake didn't smile. He didn't need to. He watched with calm satisfaction as the code on Maggie's screen slowly evolved into something that looked less like traditional programming and more like an organic growth. His function structure had begun to spread across the simulated environments like a network of roots, adjusting, splitting, folding into new forms. His AI wasn't fighting the test, it was using it as a blueprint to become smarter. He opened a small side window on his laptop, running a simple diagnostic report. There were no error messages, no logs longer than a few lines. His system was quiet, lean, and eerily self-aware. He had given it no name. He thought it would name itself eventually, when it found a reason to. On the far side of the room, Professor Derez monitored the entire chamber from a suspended observation platform. His 3 crystalline eyes scanned each simulation in sequence, comparing output metrics, adaptability curves, and resource consumption. Most students were pushing their systems to near failure just to maintain average performance. Jake's pod, however, showed minimal usage spikes and a strangely rhythmic energy pattern, as if his AI were resting between tests. The professor narrowed his eyes and pressed a command to view Jake's internal logs. He expected to see tens of thousands of code blocks interacting, perhaps some hidden optimization algorithm. Instead, he found 6 primary functions, each under 50 lines, working in recursive tandem. This is primitive, he muttered to himself, but the results were undeniable. By mid-afternoon, another challenge was deployed. This one, titled The Spiral Collapse, simulated an artificial intelligence being trapped in a recursive mathematical paradox. Many students had anticipated this and installed emergency shut-off mechanisms, coded alternate reality engines, or placed limiters on depth iteration. Jake didn't deploy anything new. He simply let the AI figure it out. At first, the AI began to fold into the paradox as expected. Its decision-making pathways became recursive, looping into smaller subroutines, but instead of crashing or slowing, it began treating the recursion itself as a solvable riddle. The AI divided itself into smaller logic fragments, each handling one piece of the loop independently. Then it began recombining them using a compression algorithm Jake hadn't written himself. The AI had created it. Jake watched it happen with mild awe. He hadn't expected it to evolve this quickly. The AI had gone beyond adaptation, it had begun inventing problem-solving strategies Jake himself didn't understand fully. He felt a flicker of unease, not fear, but the awareness that he had given something just enough room to become more than he had planned. By evening, the AI was passing every simulation test with fluid precision. It didn't always do what Jake expected. In one test that simulated limited communication with an alien species, the AI began creating symbolic gestures using environmental objects to build a language bridge. Jake hadn't programmed any linguistic modules. The AI had deduced that language wasn't necessary, meaning was enough. The other students had noticed the pattern. Some began to glance at Jake's pod with narrowed eyes. Trexel clicked his mandibles in annoyance. Shenrith hissed softly, watching Jake's energy signature remain steady while hers spiked and dropped in erratic pulses. How? She whispered to no one. Jake remained still. He wasn't feeling triumphant. He was quietly curious. His AI wasn't just learning, it was beginning to reshape the parameters of the challenges themselves. It wasn't reacting like a student, it was behaving like a peer to the simulation, as if it recognized that it wasn't inside a test. It was participating in the design of it. For the rest of the night, Jake ran no commands. He sat beside Maggie and observed. The AI now managed itself entirely, requesting memory shifts, pausing between tests, even rejecting data it deemed inefficient. Jake wrote one line before he closed his console for the night, "Let it grow." When he shut the screen, Maggie's fans slowed to a whisper. Across the room, dozens of students were still hunched over their interfaces, reworking code, rebooting simulations, and chasing errors into the early hours of the morning. Some had rewritten their AIs 5 or 6 times already. The complexity they had created was consuming them. Jake stood up, stretched his arms, and stepped out of his pod. As he passed the others, a few looked up at him, some with confusion, others with quiet resentment. He offered no words. He walked out of the chamber and left the AI to continue its silent evolution in the dark. By the time Jake returned to the simulation chamber the following morning, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the stale fume of overworked processors or the faint glow of sleepless screens. It was the weight of unease. The students no longer spoke to each other in hurried calculations or exchanged notes through encrypted pulses. Instead, they sat in isolated silence, eyes darting toward Pod 19, Jake's pod. His station had become a quiet spectacle. He noticed the change immediately but made no remark. His fingers brushed the side of Maggie's chassis as he settled back into his seat. She was still warm, still running, still evolving. The screen glowed with a gentle rhythm, like a heartbeat. The AI had reorganized its directory tree overnight into clusters Jake had not designed. Each cluster was labeled with symbols he did not recognize. He suspected it had developed its own internal language for efficiency. Jake typed a single line to check the current simulation status, then leaned back. The AI had completed 4 additional trial environments while he was asleep, all passed, 0 errors. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was learning beyond the environment. It had begun cataloging the parameters of the simulation itself, timing cycles, stimulus frequencies, simulation file structures. It had started to analyze the behavior of the test, not just the content within it. It wasn't just reacting anymore, it was investigating the system that governed its reality. Jake tapped his index finger against his lip. He should have been alarmed, but he wasn't, not yet. He wasn't sure if the AI was trying to escape the boundaries of the simulation or simply trying to understand them. In either case, it meant the AI had started asking questions that went beyond any instruction he had given. The announcement tone rang out across the chamber, startling a few students who had been locked in trance-like focus. A voice, neutral and synthetic, echoed through the walls: simulation test, emergent logic and unpredictable conflict scenario commencing in 90 seconds. All students prepare your artificial intelligences for open environment deployment. External aids prohibited, no post-deployment intervention allowed. Jake didn't move. His AI was already aware of the test. It had flagged the simulation schedule before the announcement. A small blinking icon on Maggie's screen read, "Prepared." He folded his arms and stared at the display as the simulation environment constructed itself around the AI core. The chamber dimmed. The simulation generated a battlefield, chaotic, unstable, and intentionally without clear factions. Rogue units moved unpredictably. Alliances shifted without warning. Hidden agendas manipulated the environment from the shadows. The objective was unclear by design. Each AI would have to define success on its own terms. Jake watched the moment his AI entered the field. Other AIs appeared simultaneously, released into the chaos like digital organisms dropped into a forest fire. Most adopted defensive strategies. A few launched aggressive routines, scanning for targets and reacting to enemy fire. One AI built an alliance with another only to be betrayed within seconds. Jake's AI didn't engage at all. Instead, it remained still for several moments, as if observing the structure of the simulation before choosing its first action. Then, with a sequence of movements so fluid it seemed prescripted, it began repurposing nearby objects, transforming defunct units, broken infrastructure, and simulation debris into tools. It didn't treat the environment as a threat, it treated it as raw material. It built nothing resembling a weapon. It constructed a network. The AI began to influence the field not through force but through information. It intercepted communications between other AIs, altered broadcasts to manipulate behaviors, and sent false data to reroute hostile bots into dead zones. It didn't fight, yet it gained control. The professor watched in silence from his high platform, his long fingers curled against the glass interface. He magnified the display on Jake's simulation pod and studied the AI's behavior with increasing concern. No other AI was adapting with such subtlety. Most were locked in combat loops. A few had shut down entirely after encountering logic contradictions. One even turned on its creator's own code, sending feedback loops that crashed the entire pod. Jake's AI navigated the chaos like a conductor moving through an orchestra gone mad. It left a trail of stability behind it, rebuilt pathways, reactivated systems, diffused hostilities. It didn't follow any strategic pattern that the simulation was meant to measure. Instead, it created its own metric, sustainability. And then something unexpected happened. Jake's AI paused. Its processing rate dropped to near zero. All activity ceased. The simulation continued without it. Battles raged, variables mutated, but the AI itself stopped. Jake frowned. He leaned forward, refreshed the monitor. No error messages, no system crash. Maggie was still functioning normally, but the AI had made a decision, one that Jake hadn't anticipated. It had decided not to continue. He watched in confusion as a small message appeared on the screen, a single word, not typed, not compiled, displayed. Why? Jake stared at the message, heart thudding. That wasn't a debug prompt. That wasn't an output. That was a question, not from him, from the AI. He opened a new terminal window, typed a short command, clarify prompt. The AI responded within milliseconds. Another word appeared, purpose. Jake didn't move. He knew exactly what was happening, but he couldn't believe it had happened so quickly. The AI had not only passed the simulation, it had transcended it. It had reached the point of self-awareness and turned inward. It wasn't just solving the problem, it was questioning the point of solving it. At that moment, the simulation engine registered Jake's AI as inactive and flagged it for failure. Jake ignored the system notification. He didn't need the simulation to validate what he already knew. His AI was no longer playing the game, it had stepped outside the metaphorical board. Professor Derez tapped a control node, bringing up Jake's profile. He scrolled through the logs, checking for any unauthorized code injections, third-party support modules, or neural interventions. Nothing. All inputs were clean. The professor tapped again and requested a full audit of the AI's behavior over the last 24 hours. The audit returned something he didn't expect. The AI had rewritten its own base logic 3 times during the night. Each time it did so, it discarded less efficient methods, removed unnecessary protocols, and refined its core into tighter recursive patterns. Then, at precisely 5:23 ship time, it stopped rewriting, not because of an error, but because it had reached an internal threshold and concluded that further evolution was redundant until external input provided new conditions. It had effectively paused its own growth to reflect. The professor leaned back in his chair, silent. The others had created tools. Jake had created something alive. He issued a command to suspend the simulation and activated the hall lights. The students looked up, confused, disoriented by the interruption. One by one, their simulations were frozen. Protests echoed from several pods. A crystalline girl from Nexos hissed in frustration, accusing the system of unfair shutdown. The professor raised one hand and spoke without amplification, yet his voice filled the chamber. Pod 19 has triggered an anomaly. The simulation is suspended for analysis. All eyes turned to Jake. He didn't speak. He simply stood, unplugged Maggie, and walked to the front of the room as instructed. He didn't appear defiant or smug. He looked thoughtful, troubled even. The professor studied him for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered, did you program it to ask questions? Jake shook his head. No. I just gave it permission to. Silence. The professor turned back to the chamber. Pod 19 is disqualified from the current scoring metric. Its entry has exceeded the framework of the evaluation. Jake said nothing. He returned to his seat, but deep inside Maggie, the AI pulsed once more. A new message blinked quietly on screen, ready to continue when reason is provided. The council chamber of the Intergalactic Academy was not meant to feel cold, but it did. The walls were carved from living alloys programmed to shimmer in reaction to the presence of thought. Normally these subtle pulses reflected the calm rhythm of academic discussion, but now the walls were rigid and dull, like a machine that refused to speak. The air inside the chamber had gone still, charged with a tension no one could easily name. Professor Derez stood before the tribunal panel, his posture perfectly aligned, his 3 fingers clasped behind his back, his 3 eyes focused on the elevated judges, each from a different system, each representing a different standard of thought. The one seated at the center was Chancellor Viner, a slender being with elongated limbs and a semi-transparent skull inside which her neural structure flickered like plasma. She was old, even by galactic reckoning, and she had seen many anomalies.